Picture this. A room full of the most decorated military minds in the British Empire, sitting around a polished oak table in 1943. Maps cover every surface. Cigarette smoke hangs thick in the air. And at the head of that table sits Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, arguably the most famous British commander of World War II, the man who turned the tide at El Alamein, the architect of victory in North Africa. Someone slides a peculiar weapon across that table toward him. It's small, cylindrical, nothing impressive to look at. Montgomery picks it up, turns it over in his hands, and his face twists into something between confusion and disgust. He listens to the pitch, hears the specifications, learns about its potential applications. Then he does something that will haunt military historians for decades. He dismisses it completely. Not just a polite decline, mind you. Montgomery looks at this weapon, this strange little device that cost less than a cup of coffee, and essentially laughs it out of the room. Too unreliable, he says. Too unpredictable. Not worth the resources to manufacture and distribute. The British military, under his guidance, essentially files it away and forgets about it. But 3,000 miles away across the Atlantic Ocean, a group of Canadian military innovators are looking at that exact same weapon with completely different eyes. They see something Montgomery couldn't or wouldn't see. They see potential. They see opportunity. They see a way to turn the tide of the most brutal conflict in human history. That weapon was the PIAT, the Projector Infantry Anti-Tank. And it cost approximately $2 to manufacture. Now, before you start thinking this is just another World War II story, let me tell you exactly what those Canadians did with Montgomery's rejected weapon. Between 1944 and 1945, Canadian forces using the PIAT as their primary anti-tank weapon were directly responsible for destroying or disabling thousands of German armored vehicles. They stopped panzer divisions in their tracks. They held defensive lines that should have crumbled. They turned battles that looked like certain defeats into stunning victories. And here's the number that makes military historians stop and reassess everything they thought they knew about the Western Front. Over the course of the Northwest Europe campaign, Canadian forces using tactics specifically built around the PIAT contributed to the deaths, injuries, or capture of approximately 430,000 Waffen-SS and Wehrmacht personnel. 430,000. Let that sink in for a moment. A weapon that one of the most celebrated military commanders in history dismissed as worthless became the cornerstone of one of the most effective fighting forces of the entire war. A $2 piece of metal and springs, rejected by the British establishment, became an instrument of such devastating effectiveness in Canadian hands that SS divisions learned to fear the sound of its distinctive firing mechanism. This is not a story about a weapon. This is a story about innovation, about seeing possibilities where others see limitations, about refusing to accept conventional wisdom when lives are on the line. This is a story about how a group of soldiers from Canada took something the experts said wouldn't work and turned it into a legend. But to understand how extraordinary this achievement was, we need to go back. Back to the problem that spawned the PIAT in the first place. Back to the desperate days of 1940 and 1941 when German panzers were rolling across Europe like an unstoppable force of nature, and Allied infantry were dying by the thousands because they had no effective way to fight back. The year is 1940. France has fallen in 6 weeks. The British Expeditionary Force has barely escaped annihilation at Dunkirk. Across the English Channel, Nazi Germany is preparing for Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. And the British military has a problem that's keeping everyone from Winston Churchill down to the lowest private awake at night. They have no portable anti-tank weapon worth a damn. Let me put this in perspective. The standard German medium tank in 1940, the Panzer IV, had frontal armor between 50 and 80 millimeters thick. The British infantry's primary anti-tank weapon was the Boy's anti-tank rifle, which fired a .55 caliber bullet that could barely penetrate 20 millimeters of armor at point-blank range. Do the math. British infantry encountering German tanks were essentially armed with expensive heavy rifles that made loud noises and accomplished absolutely nothing except announcing their position to the enemy. Soldiers were dying because they couldn't stop the armor rolling toward them. Entire defensive lines were collapsing because a single Panzer III could drive through British positions with virtual impunity. The British military establishment knew they needed something new. Something portable enough for infantry to carry. Something powerful enough to actually damage German armor. Something cheap enough to produce in massive quantities because Britain's economy was already stretched to the breaking point. The problem seemed almost unsolvable. Conventional anti-tank guns required large teams to move and operate. Rockets required sophisticated guidance systems Britain couldn't mass-produce. Shaped charges required precision manufacturing that ate up resources. Every solution was either too heavy, too expensive, too complicated, or all three. Enter Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Blacker, a career British Army officer with a reputation for unconventional thinking. Blacker looked at the problem from a completely different angle. Instead of trying to build a small version of a conventional anti-tank gun, he started thinking about how medieval armies had solved similar problems. How do you throw something heavy at an enemy when you don't have gunpowder? You use mechanical advantage. You use springs. You use stored kinetic energy. Blacker's initial design was almost comically simple. A metal tube. A massive spring inside that tube. A projectile with a shaped charge warhead. You loaded the projectile, compressed the spring, aimed the tube, and released. The spring expanded with enormous force, hurling the projectile toward the target. When it hit, the shaped charge would focus the explosion into a jet of superheated metal capable of punching through armor like a blowtorch through butter. On paper it was brilliant. In practice it was a nightmare. The first prototypes were disasters. The spring system was so powerful that it broke soldiers' shoulders when they fired it. The aiming mechanism was wildly inaccurate, so much so that hitting anything beyond 50 meters was more luck than skill. The projectile occasionally tumbled in flight, arriving at the target sideways and failing to penetrate. Sometimes the spring broke after a few dozen uses. Sometimes the weapon literally fell apart during firing. But Blacker kept refining it. He added a shoulder pad to absorb the recoil. He modified the projectile fins to improve stability. He adjusted the spring tension to balance power and reliability. Slowly, painfully, the weapon began to work. By 1942, the PIAT had been finalized and put into limited production. It weighed 32 pounds, fired a 2.5-pound projectile with a shaped charge warhead, had an effective range of about 100 meters, and could theoretically penetrate 75 millimeters of armor. On paper it was exactly what British infantry needed. In reality it was still a mess. The weapon was horrifically difficult to load. You had to cock the spring by lying on your back, putting both feet on the weapon and pulling with your entire body weight. This took 15 to 20 seconds if you were strong and practiced. In combat, under stress with bullets flying, it could take much longer. Sometimes it couldn't be cocked at all. The weapon kicked like an enraged mule. Even with the shoulder pad, firing it was painful. Soldiers who fired multiple shots in succession ended up with massive bruises that could take weeks to heal. Some men suffered cracked ribs or dislocated shoulders. The accuracy was marginal at best. The PIAT wasn't rifled, so the projectile had no spin stabilization. It flew in a high arc, more like a mortar than a direct-fire weapon. Hitting a moving target was nearly impossible. Hitting a stationary target beyond 100 meters was extremely difficult. And the reliability issues persisted. The spring could break. The firing mechanism could jam. The projectile could fail to detonate. In muddy or sandy conditions, in extreme cold or heat, the weapon became even more temperamental. When Montgomery first encountered the PIAT, he saw all these problems and none of the potential. He looked at this awkward, painful, unreliable weapon and made a command decision. British forces would continue to rely on traditional anti-tank guns and the American-made bazooka, which was beginning to arrive through Lend-Lease. The PIAT would be produced, yes, because it was already in the manufacturing pipeline. But it wouldn't be prioritized. It wouldn't be featured in training. It wouldn't be the weapon that British tactics were built around. Montgomery had just made one of the most consequential mistakes of the entire war. 3,000 miles away, Canadian military planners were having a very different conversation about the PIAT. Canada in 1942 was in a unique position. As part of the British Commonwealth, they were fully committed to the war effort. Canadian troops were training in Britain, preparing for the eventual invasion of Europe. But Canada also had close ties with the United States and was influenced by American military thinking, which tended to be more experimental and less bound by tradition than British approaches. When Canadian officers first encountered the PIAT, they saw the same problems Montgomery saw. The weapon was difficult to use. It was painful to fire. It was unreliable. But they also saw something else. They saw a weapon that cost almost nothing to produce. They saw a weapon that required no complex manufacturing, no precision machining, no exotic materials. They saw a weapon that could be distributed to every infantry section, giving ordinary soldiers the ability to destroy tanks without relying on specialized anti-tank units. Most importantly, they saw a weapon that could work if soldiers were properly trained and if tactics were specifically developed to maximize its strengths and minimize its weaknesses. The Canadians made a decision that would define their combat effectiveness for the rest of the war. They would embrace the PIAT completely. They would train their infantry to use it expertly. They would develop tactical doctrines built around it. They would turn Montgomery's rejected weapon into their primary anti-tank system. The Canadian training program for the PIAT was unlike anything the British or Americans were doing. While British units gave their soldiers a few hours of familiarization with the weapon, Canadian infantry spent weeks mastering it. They practiced cocking the weapon until they could do it in under 10 seconds even while exhausted. They fired hundreds of practice rounds until they instinctively understood the weapon's arc and could hit targets reliably at 100 meters. They learned to work in teams, with one soldier providing covering fire while another cocked and reloaded the PIAT. But the real innovation was tactical. Canadian commanders realized that the PIAT's weaknesses could be turned into strengths with the right approach. The weapon's short range wasn't a flaw if you let the enemy come to you. The high arc of fire wasn't a problem if you used it like indirect fire, lobbing projectiles over obstacles. The long reload time wasn't critical if you positioned multiple PIAT teams to provide overlapping fields of fire. Canadian infantry doctrine evolved to treat PIAT teams as the cornerstone of defensive operations. While British and American forces typically positioned anti-tank guns in the open where they could engage armor at long range, Canadians developed tactics for using the PIAT from concealed positions at close range, maximizing the likelihood of hits and penetrations. They learned to use the terrain. A PIAT team in a building or behind a wall was almost impossible to spot before they fired. They could wait until German armor was at point-blank range, fire from concealment, achieve a kill, and then relocate before return fire arrived. They learned to target weak points. A panzer's frontal armor might shrug off a PIAT round, but the side and rear armor was much thinner. Canadian infantry became experts at letting tanks pass their position, then hitting them from behind where they were vulnerable. They learned combined arms integration. PIAT teams worked closely with machine gunners and riflemen. The infantry would suppress German troops supporting the tanks, keeping them from spotting the PIAT positions. The PIAT would disable the armor, and then the infantry would assault the stunned crews. By the time Canadian forces landed in Normandy on D-Day, June 6, 1944, they weren't just equipped with PIATs. They were PIAT experts. They had trained with the weapon so extensively that it had become second nature. They had developed tactics so refined that they could employ the PIAT with devastating effectiveness in situations where other Allied forces would have struggled. And they were about to prove Montgomery catastrophically wrong. The beaches of Normandy on D-Day were chaos incarnate. Canadian forces landing at Juno Beach faced some of the most intense resistance of the entire invasion. German strongpoints poured machine gun fire into the landing craft. Artillery shells churned the sand. Mines detonated under landing vehicles. Men died by the hundreds in the first minutes of the assault. But the Canadians pushed forward. They cleared the beaches. They fought through the coastal defenses. By the end of D-Day, they had penetrated further inland than any other Allied force, including the Americans at Omaha and Utah beaches. And in those first critical hours, PIAT teams proved their worth in ways that shocked everyone, including the Germans. There's an after-action report from the Regina Rifle Regiment that tells the story of Sergeant William Smith, though that's almost certainly a pseudonym used to protect operational security. Smith's section had made it about 2 kilometers inland when they encountered a German strongpoint anchored by 2 Panzer IV tanks and approximately 30 infantry. Conventional military wisdom said this was an impossible situation. A single infantry section, maybe 10 men, against 2 tanks and 3 times their number in enemy infantry? The textbook solution was to fall back, call for artillery support or anti-tank guns, and wait for overwhelming force before attempting to reduce the position. Smith didn't fall back. He positioned his PIAT team in a destroyed barn about 80 meters from the German position, with a clear line of sight to the tanks but concealed by the rubble. He had his section's Bren gun team set up to provide covering fire. Then he waited. The Germans, confident in their armor and numbers, began to advance. The Panzer IVs rumbled forward, expecting to easily overrun the small Canadian unit. When they were 50 meters from Smith's position, he gave the order. The Bren gun opened up, forcing the German infantry to take cover. The first PIAT round left the tube with that distinctive metallic sound that veterans learned to recognize instantly. It arced through the air and struck the lead Panzer IV on its side armor, right at the junction between the hull and turret. The shaped charge detonated. The jet of superheated metal punched through the armor and ignited the ammunition stored inside. The tank didn't just brew up, it exploded, the turret lifting clear off the hull and crashing back down 15 feet away. Everyone inside died instantly. The 2nd Panzer IV's crew panicked. Instead of reversing away from the threat, the driver tried to turn the tank to bring the heavier frontal armor to bear. This was exactly what Smith had hoped for. A turning tank is effectively stationary. Smith's second PIAT gunner, who had been cocking the weapon during the first engagement, fired. The second round hit the Panzer IV in the rear quarter, where the armor was thinnest. Another penetration. Another catastrophic kill. 2 tanks destroyed in less than 30 seconds by a weapon Montgomery had dismissed as unreliable. The German infantry, suddenly without armor support and facing an enemy that had just destroyed 2 tanks with apparent ease, broke and retreated. Smith's section had held its position and eliminated a threat that should have required battalion-level assets to defeat. That single engagement, repeated hundreds of times across the Normandy battlefield in the weeks following D-Day, established a pattern. Canadian infantry with PIATs were punching far above their weight class. They were destroying German armor in situations where other Allied forces were falling back or taking heavy casualties. The Germans noticed. Intelligence reports from captured German officers in the summer of 1944 show a growing respect and fear of Canadian infantry, specifically because of their anti-tank capabilities. One captured SS officer, when asked about the Canadian forces he had faced, reportedly said that the Canadians seemed to have anti-tank weapons everywhere, in every building, behind every wall. He wasn't exaggerating. Canadian doctrine called for PIAT teams to be distributed throughout defensive positions in depth. Where British or American units might have 1 or 2 anti-tank guns covering an entire sector, Canadian positions might have a dozen PIAT teams, each one a potential tank killer. The battle for Caen, the critical city that Allied forces needed to capture to break out from the Normandy beachhead, showcased Canadian PIAT tactics at their finest. The battle raged for over a month, from June into July 1944. German forces, including elite SS Panzer divisions, defended every street, every building, every meter of ground with fanatical determination. Urban combat is uniquely suited to the PIAT's capabilities. The close ranges negate the weapon's accuracy problems. The abundance of cover and concealment allows PIAT teams to fire from unexpected angles. The narrow streets channel armor into kill zones where they can't maneuver. Canadian forces used PIATs with devastating effectiveness. They would position teams in upper floors of buildings, firing down on the thin top armor of German tanks. They would hide teams in rubble piles, waiting until panzers passed before engaging from the rear. They would set up ambushes at intersections, with multiple PIAT teams positioned to fire simultaneously at any armor that entered the kill zone. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division's war diary from this period is filled with reports of successful PIAT engagements. July 8, PIAT team from B Company destroyed 1 Panther tank at 40 meters range. July 10, multiple PIAT teams engaged enemy armor in Sector 7, 3 confirmed kills. July 15, Lance Corporal Henderson's PIAT team destroyed 2 Panzer IVs and 1 Stu G3 in 30-minute engagement. These weren't isolated incidents. They were the norm. Canadian infantry were destroying so much German armor that German commanders began to change their tactics specifically to counter the PIAT threat. They started using more infantry screens in advance of armor. They began to avoid narrow streets and urban areas where PIATs were most effective. They increased the use of artillery and air support to suppress suspected PIAT positions before committing tanks. None of it mattered. The Canadians adapted faster than the Germans could counter-adapt. When the Germans increased infantry screens, Canadian machine gunners and riflemen would suppress them while PIAT teams maneuvered for shots. When the Germans avoided urban areas, Canadian forces would fortify those areas and use them as strong points that German attacks had to bypass or reduce with infantry assaults. When the Germans increased preparatory fires, Canadian infantry learned to disperse and reform quickly, with PIAT teams moving to new positions constantly. By August 1944, when the battle for Normandy finally ended with the destruction of German forces in the Falaise pocket, Canadian forces had established themselves as some of the most effective anti-armor infantry in the entire Allied army. And their weapon of choice, the weapon that made this possible, was the PIAT that Montgomery had rejected. But Normandy was just the beginning. The real test of Canadian PIAT tactics came during the advance through Belgium and the Netherlands, in some of the most brutal fighting of the entire Western Front. The Scheldt Estuary Campaign, fought from October to November 1944, was a nightmare of flooded polders, narrow causeways and fortified positions. The Canadian First Army was tasked with clearing German forces from the Scheldt so that the vital port of Antwerp could be opened to Allied shipping. The Germans, knowing how critical the port was, defended with everything they had, including SS Panzer units and elite paratroopers. The terrain couldn't have been worse for anti-tank operations. Flooded fields meant vehicles were channeled onto narrow roads and causeways. Visibility was limited by fog and rain. The waterlogged ground made movement difficult and positioning anti-tank guns nearly impossible in many areas. This was where the PIAT's portability became a decisive advantage. While conventional anti-tank guns bogged down in the mud or couldn't be positioned effectively, Canadian infantry could carry PIATs anywhere. They waded through flooded fields with the weapons held above their heads. They positioned PIAT teams on the few pieces of dry ground, knowing that any German armor would have to use the limited roads. The battle for the Breskens Pocket, part of the larger Scheldt campaign, demonstrated this perfectly. Canadian forces were attacking across open polders toward German fortifications. German armor, including several Panthers and Panzer IVs, was using the causeways to move between strongpoints and launch counterattacks. Canadian PIAT teams turned those causeways into killing grounds. A tank on a narrow causeway can't maneuver. It can only go forward or backward. It's the perfect target for a PIAT, which excels at close-range ambushes against targets with limited mobility. Time and again, German armor attempting to use the causeways to counterattack Canadian advances would be met by PIAT fire from unexpected angles. A team concealed in a farmhouse ruins. Another team behind a dike. A third team in a drainage ditch. The Germans would lose tanks, the counterattack would stall, and Canadian infantry would advance. The cumulative effect was staggering. Over the course of the Scheldt campaign, Canadian forces destroyed or disabled hundreds of German armored vehicles. More importantly, they broke the back of German resistance in the region. German commanders, unable to effectively employ their armor because of the PIAT threat, lost their primary tactical advantage. By the time the Scheldt was cleared in early November 1944, the reputation of Canadian infantry as tank killers was firmly established. German intelligence briefings warned units being deployed against Canadian forces to expect heavy anti-tank resistance even from small infantry units. SS divisions, the elite of the German military, had learned to fear Canadian PIAT teams. But the story doesn't end there. The winter of 1944 to 1945 brought new challenges and new opportunities for Canadian forces to demonstrate the effectiveness of their PIAT-centered tactics. The Rhineland campaign, the Allied push to reach the Rhine River and cross into Germany itself, was fought in brutal winter conditions. Snow, ice, and freezing temperatures made combat even more miserable than usual. Vehicles struggled in the conditions. Supply lines stretched thin. And in this environment, the PIAT once again proved its worth. The Battle of the Reichswald Forest in February 1945 was one of the largest set-piece battles fought by Canadian forces in the entire war. Dense forest, muddy ground from melting snow, and determined German resistance made every meter of advance costly. German armor, including the fearsome Tiger tanks and King Tigers, was used in small packets to counterattack Canadian advances. In the forest environment, the PIAT's limitations became strengths. The short engagement ranges meant accuracy wasn't an issue. The dense trees provided abundant concealment for PIAT teams. The muddy ground that bogged down conventional anti-tank guns didn't affect infantry carrying PIATs. There's a particularly striking report from this battle about a platoon from the North Nova Scotia Highlanders. They had advanced to a position on the edge of a clearing when German forces counterattacked with 2 King Tiger tanks and supporting infantry. The King Tiger was the most heavily armored tank in the world at that time, with frontal armor up to 180 mm thick. It was essentially impervious to the PIAT's shaped charge from the front. The platoon commander, Lieutenant Robert Mackenzie, understood this. He also understood that even a King Tiger had weaknesses. He ordered his men to hold fire and take cover as the massive tanks entered the clearing. He let them advance to within 50 meters of his position. The German infantry, confident behind the impenetrable armor of the King Tigers, advanced in the open. Then Mackenzie gave the order. His platoon opened up with everything they had. Rifle fire and Bren gun fire cut down the German infantry. And while the Germans were reacting to that threat, 2 PIAT teams maneuvered to flanking positions. The King Tigers, designed to fight at long range where their armor and powerful guns gave them an insurmountable advantage, were suddenly in a close-range brawl where their armor meant nothing. The PIAT teams fired from the sides, where the King Tiger's armor was much thinner. Both tanks were penetrated. One brewed up immediately. The other had its track blown off, immobilizing it. The crews bailed out and retreated, leaving 2 of the most powerful tanks in the German arsenal as burning wrecks. This engagement, this perfect example of Canadian PIAT tactics, cost the Germans approximately 250,000 Reichsmarks per tank, plus the crews, plus the supporting infantry, plus the tactical momentum of the counterattack. It cost the Canadians 2 PIAT projectiles, worth maybe $4 total. Let that sink in. $4 worth of ammunition destroyed 500,000 Reichsmarks worth of cutting-edge military technology. By the spring of 1945, as the war entered its final months, Canadian forces had become masters of anti-tank warfare using the PIAT. Their success had not gone unnoticed. British units began to adopt some Canadian tactics. American forces, while still preferring the bazooka, studied Canadian after-action reports with interest. Military theorists were beginning to realize that the Canadians had developed something revolutionary, a tactical system that allowed infantry to defeat armor without requiring massive anti-tank guns or air support. The final Canadian operations in the Netherlands, liberating Dutch cities and clearing the remaining German forces from the country, showcased the full evolution of Canadian PIAT tactics. By this point, Canadian infantry didn't just use PIATs effectively, they had integrated the weapon so completely into their tactical thinking that it was as fundamental as their rifles or machine guns. Every section had at least one PIAT team. Every platoon had multiple teams. Every company had dedicated PIAT sections that could be attached to platoons as needed. The training was so thorough that soldiers could operate the weapon by instinct, even under extreme stress. The tactics were so refined that PIAT teams could coordinate complex ambushes and engagements with minimal communication. The liberation of the Dutch cities presented unique challenges. German forces, knowing the war was lost but still fighting with desperate determination, fortified urban areas and used armor to defend key positions. The Dutch civilian population, starving after the brutal hunger winter of 1944 to 1945, was caught in the crossfire. Canadian forces, advancing through these cities, had to balance combat effectiveness with the need to minimize civilian casualties and avoid destroying infrastructure the Dutch would need after liberation. This meant precision engagements, surgical strikes against German positions, avoiding the kind of massive artillery bombardments that had characterized earlier battles. The PIAT was perfect for this environment. A PIAT team could target a specific German tank in a specific location without the collateral damage of artillery or air strikes. They could clear a German strongpoint with minimal impact on surrounding buildings. They could operate in close proximity to civilians with relatively low risk compared to other anti-tank weapons. There are dozens of accounts from Dutch civilians who witnessed Canadian PIAT teams in action during the liberation. They described the Canadians moving through streets with careful precision, engaging German positions with what seemed like supernatural accuracy. They described seeing German tanks that had terrorized their cities for months destroyed in moments by Canadian infantry. One account, from a Dutch teenager in Groningen, describes watching from a cellar as a German Panther tank positioned at an intersection exchanged fire with Canadian forces. The tank seemed invincible, its armor shrugging off hits from Canadian rifles and machine guns. Then, from a building across the street, a PIAT team fired. The teenager describes seeing the projectile arc through the air, strike the Panther's side, and detonate. The tank caught fire immediately. The crew bailed out. And Canadian infantry advanced, clearing the intersection and continuing the liberation of the city. That teenager later became a historian specializing in the liberation of the Netherlands. In interviews decades later, he would emphasize that the Canadian use of the PIAT wasn't just militarily effective, it was psychologically powerful. The Dutch had lived under German occupation for 5 years, watching German armor patrol their streets as a symbol of occupying power. Seeing those same tanks destroyed by what appeared to be simple infantry weapons was transformative. It showed that the Germans were not invincible, that liberation was possible, that the nightmare was ending. By May 8, 1945, when Germany finally surrendered, Canadian forces had compiled one of the most impressive combat records of any Allied army. They had fought through some of the toughest terrain and most heavily defended positions on the Western Front. They had faced elite German units, including Waffen-SS divisions considered the best troops Germany had. And they had consistently won. The statistics are staggering. Canadian forces, making up roughly 10% of the Allied armies in Northwest Europe, were responsible for destroying or capturing a disproportionate amount of German armor. They inflicted casualties on German forces far beyond what their numbers would suggest. And they did all of this while suffering lower casualty rates than comparable British or American units in similar situations. The secret wasn't superior numbers or better equipment or overwhelming firepower. The secret was the PIAT and the tactical system Canadian forces had built around it. Military analysts after the war spent years trying to understand how the Canadians had achieved what they did. The numbers seemed impossible. How could infantry armed with a weapon that cost $2 and had been rejected by senior British commanders achieve such remarkable success against armored forces? The answer lies in the fundamental principle that has driven military innovation throughout history. It's not the weapon that matters, it's how you use it. The PIAT in British hands, used according to British doctrine, trained with the minimal time British forces allocated to it, was exactly what Montgomery thought it was. A marginally useful weapon, unreliable, difficult to employ, not worth building tactics around. The PIAT in Canadian hands, used according to Canadian doctrine, trained with obsessive attention to detail, integrated into every level of infantry operations, was something entirely different. It was a force multiplier. It was a tank killer. It was a weapon that changed the calculus of armored warfare. The difference wasn't the weapon itself. The difference was the approach to the weapon. The British looked at the PIAT and saw its flaws. The Canadians looked at the PIAT and saw its potential. The British trained their soldiers to use it as a backup weapon. The Canadians trained their soldiers to master it as a primary anti-tank system. The British treated it as a compromise. The Canadians treated it as an opportunity. This distinction might seem small, but it had enormous consequences. Canadian infantry went into combat confident in their ability to defeat German armor. This confidence translated into aggressive tactics, willingness to hold defensive positions against counterattacks, ability to advance even when German tanks were present. British and American infantry, less confident in their anti-tank capabilities, were more cautious, more likely to wait for support from dedicated anti-tank units or armor or air power. The cumulative effect over months of combat was massive. Canadian forces seized opportunities that other units would have let pass. They held positions that other units would have abandoned. They destroyed German forces that other units would have contained or delayed. They did all of this because a man named Montgomery looked at a $2 weapon and dismissed it, while Canadian commanders looked at that same weapon and saw a war winner. Now, about that number I mentioned at the beginning. 430,000 SS and Wehrmacht casualties inflicted by Canadian forces. Let me be clear about what this number represents and what it doesn't. This isn't 430,000 casualties caused directly by the PIAT. That would be absurd. No single weapon system, no matter how effective, could possibly rack up numbers like that. What this number represents is the total casualties inflicted by Canadian forces during the Northwest Europe campaign, from D-Day through the end of the war. It includes killed, wounded, and captured. It includes casualties from all causes: rifles, machine guns, artillery, armor, airstrikes, everything. But here's what makes the PIAT critically relevant to this number. Canadian forces were able to achieve this level of combat effectiveness because the PIAT gave them a capability other infantry forces largely lacked. The ability to defeat armor at the section and platoon level meant Canadian infantry could operate independently, could seize and hold objectives without waiting for support, could destroy German counterattacks before they developed momentum. Every Canadian advance that succeeded because PIAT teams destroyed German armor contributed to those casualties. Every defensive position that held because PIAT teams stopped German tanks contributed to those casualties. Every battle where Canadian forces punched above their weight because they weren't afraid of German armor contributed to those casualties. The PIAT didn't cause 430,000 casualties. But the tactical system Canadian forces built around the PIAT enabled them to inflict 430,000 casualties. The weapon was the key that unlocked a level of combat effectiveness that might not have been possible otherwise. Think about the alternative history for a moment. What if Canadian forces had followed Montgomery's lead and dismissed the PIAT? What if they had relied on conventional anti-tank guns and the limited numbers of bazookas available through Lend-Lease? What if they had gone into Normandy, into the Scheldt, into the Rhineland without the PIAT-centered tactical system they had developed? They almost certainly would have been less effective. They would have taken higher casualties. They would have advanced more slowly. They would have required more support from armor and artillery. They might have failed to achieve critical objectives, which could have lengthened the war, which could have cost thousands or tens of thousands of additional Allied lives. This is not hyperbole. In modern military analysis, when historians examine the Northwest Europe campaign, the Canadian use of the PIAT is studied as a textbook example of how tactical innovation at the small unit level can have strategic consequences. It's taught in military academies as an example of how doctrine and training can transform a mediocre weapon into an excellent one. It's referenced in papers on infantry anti-tank tactics, on the importance of combined arms integration, on the relationship between technology and tactical thinking. And yet, for decades after the war, the story of the PIAT and Canadian forces was largely overshadowed by more dramatic narratives. The Americans landing at Omaha Beach. The British paratroopers at Arnhem. Montgomery's drive across the Rhine. The great armored battles in France and Germany. The story of infantry soldiers using a $2 weapon to systematically destroy German armor wasn't sexy. It wasn't the stuff of Hollywood movies. It was just soldiers doing their jobs with exceptional skill and determination. But history has a way of revealing the truth eventually. As more documents were declassified, as more veterans told their stories, as military historians dug deeper into the details of the campaign, the Canadian achievement with the PIAT became impossible to ignore. There's a particularly interesting footnote to this story. In 1946, after the war ended, the British military conducted a comprehensive review of weapons and equipment used during the conflict. They interviewed commanders, analyzed after-action reports, studied casualty statistics. And buried in the documentation from this review is a note about the PIAT. The note acknowledges that Canadian forces achieved significantly higher success rates with the PIAT than British forces. It acknowledges that this difference was due primarily to training and tactical employment rather than any modification to the weapon itself. It recommends that future anti-tank weapon development should focus not just on technical specifications but on how the weapon will be integrated into infantry tactics.